All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's monthly Act and Learn webinar for October 2017. Tonight's topic is very timely, Defend Title IX. So first, by way of introductions, your hosts are the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction. This first voice you're hearing is myself. I'm Erin Matson. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia.
And this is Pamela Merritt, and I am based in St. Louis, Missouri.
So thanks so much for joining us tonight. So you see our agenda and what we've got planned. We're going to introduce Reproaction. We're going to do an overview of the issue of sexual assault on campus. Then we'll move from there to our panel discussion, and then we'll move to next steps and Q&A. And if you have questions for our panelists or for Caitlin from our team at any point during the presentation, please just chat those into the questions box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. So first, a bit about our organization. Reproaction is a new direct action group forming to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We're incredibly proud of our left flank analysis, and we have a willingness to hold people on all sides of the issue accountable, whether they're traditionally considered allies or opposition. We have a deep commitment to nonviolent direct action as one of the tactics that we use. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Caitlin Blunny, our organizer, who's based right here in Northern Virginia, to do an overview of sexual assault on campus.
Awesome, thank you so much, and hi everybody. So I'm going to walk us through some context for this webinar with some information about Betsy DeVos, as well as some information about sexual assault on campus. So it's important to look at how we actually got here. So back in January, Trump appointed Betsy DeVos as the Secretary of Education, and her swearing in was controversial for a variety of reasons, some of which are outlined here on the slide. But essentially, she's been talking a lot this year about rolling back regulations for schools. She's threatened to roll back protections for LGBTQ students and disabled students. And over the summer, she notably met with men's rights activists to talk about Title IX. So unfortunately, this fall, she made some real steps moving forward. At the end of September, she announced that the Department of Education would rescind guidelines for Title IX, which is what this webinar is going to explore. So to get an idea of how pervasive sexual assault and harassment is on college campuses across the country, I just wanted to bring up some statistics. So 1 in 5 women will be sexually assaulted in college, that is 20% of women. And it's also important to look at the rates of sexual violence among LGBTQ students. So if we look, gay and bisexual men are 10 times more likely to experience sexual assault than heterosexual men. 46% of bisexual women will be sexually assaulted compared to 13% of lesbian women and 17% of heterosexual women. And 21% of transgender, genderqueer, gender nonconforming college students will also be sexually assaulted. I also want to point out that individuals who identify as disabled are 3 times as likely to experience sexual violence than people who don't identify as disabled. And this is important because 11% of students identify as disabled, which makes up over 2 million students in the undergraduate school system. So now that we have an idea of how widespread sexual assault and harassment is, it's important to look at the outcomes, which are on the next slide. So only 20% of female student victims will report to law enforcement. Of the things that are reported, only 2 to 10% of the reports are false reports. And this rate in no way exceeds the false reporting rates of other crimes. And it's also important when looking at this number to understand that if a survivor chooses for whatever reason to recant, whether it's they don't want to go through the process anymore, they don't want to deal with anything that comes with going through our legal system and discontinue the report, that goes into the false reporting number. And I also just want to point out that for every 100 rapes committed, approximately 2 rapists will serve a day in prison. So now that we have an idea of how widespread this is, I'm going to flip it back to Erin.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin, for that overview. So I'm going to introduce Ellen Erdley, who is an attorney. She's an expert in Title IX and discrimination law. She's a partner at the Washington, D.C. law firm of Mary & Scallett, where she represents people who have experienced sex discrimination, sexual assault, and civil rights violations. From 2015 to September 2017, Ellen served as the first Title IX coordinator for the University of Missouri, where she founded the Office for Civil Rights in Title IX, built a strong team of equity specialists, and oversaw hundreds of complaints of discrimination and sexual violence. Earlier in her career, Ellen taught sex-based discrimination at the American University Washington College of Law and worked at the National Women's Law Center. Ellen, thank you so much for joining us and lending your expertise to this webinar tonight.
Thank you so much, Erin, and everyone on the call for having me. I'm excited to be part of a really great group of people that are committed to social justice, and I'm really honored to spend this time together. I'm going to be talking today about Title IX. I want to give you a little bit of background on it so we have even more of a landscape for our discussion, and I'm going to talk from my experiences working on Title IX matters as a lawyer, as an advocate, but also during the brief time that I served as a Title IX coordinator at the University of Missouri. But I speak for myself. I'm not speaking for my current law firm or the University of Missouri. So the important thing to remember about Title IX is that it's a law that's been around for a really long time. It was a law that was passed in 1972, along with a series of civil rights laws. So in the 60s and 70s, we're really seeing a lot of laws ensuring or protecting various kinds of rights. And this was focused on education and sex discrimination. So what the law says is really basic. It says that there can't be discrimination on the basis of sex in federally funded educational programs. And it was pretty widespread. There are certain schools that the law doesn't apply to, but nowadays, most schools and colleges receive federal funds and therefore must comply with Title IX and not discriminate on the basis of sex. So over the years, people have realized that Title IX is going to change the environment in a number of ways. So in the 70s, a lot of people talked about Title IX opening up admissions to different colleges and universities, expanding women's opportunity to play athletics, making sure that women had equal access to scholarships, different types of classes and student organizations. But then when we got to the 90s and we became more aware as a society of what sexual harassment was, Title IX began to be a law that was used to fight sexual harassment in school. It was also used for employees of schools to say that they shouldn't experience sex discrimination or sexual harassment. I also want to point out, because of Reproaction's focus, that Title IX itself expressly says that it's neutral with regard to abortion. So it says it doesn't support abortion, but also people shouldn't experience discrimination with regard to abortion. So that's just a really high level of the background of Title IX, and it's important to keep in mind that it's an old, long-standing civil rights law. With that, we can go to the next slide. So the law prohibits what is called discrimination on the basis of sex, and I wanted to talk about the breadth of what that means and what it may mean now. So historically, sex discrimination under the law has been thought of really basically in binary terms of someone's sex as male or female. And slowly, when the courts have interpreted the law, they have grown to see that discrimination on the basis of sex also includes our gender, how we identify our gender. So gender stereotypes are also prohibited under Title IX. In the Obama administration, very recently, the Department of Education, Department of Justice has made clear that discrimination on the basis of sex also prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender identity and gender expression. So your internal feeling of what your gender is and your external expression of your gender as well. And that sexual orientation discrimination was also a form of sex discrimination. I have question marks on the slide here because it's not clear under the Trump administration's actions whether or not these types of discrimination are going to be considered sex discrimination that is prohibited under Title IX. That's a significant rollback. Pregnancy discrimination is prohibited under Title IX, and so is sexual harassment. And then most recently, I would say in the 2000s and 2010s, we've seen a focus on sexual assault, or what the Department of Education used to call sexual violence. So sexual violence is just an extreme form of sexual harassment that is prohibited by the law. And that includes what we would call rape or sexual assault. A lot of schools call it sexual misconduct, stalking on the basis of sex, intimate partner violence, or dating or domestic violence, and sexual exploitation, which is really common and I think under talked about in terms of sexual harassment on college campuses. And this can range from individuals taking pictures of one another without their consent and sending them on social media in order to exploit one another, or letting their friend watch someone have sex while they're having sex without telling their sexual partner. Those would be two examples of sexual exploitation. So as you can see, Title IX is a really important law because it does a lot to protect against discrimination on the basis of sex, and it really makes clear that schools and colleges have obligations. We can go to our next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about these obligations that schools have under Title IX, and this comes from Title IX, the law itself, and some of the regulations that the Department of Education has put forward. First of all, schools for a long time, decades, were supposed to have a Title IX coordinator. That position, unfortunately, has gone unfilled for many decades at numerous college campuses and universities, as well as elementary and K-12 schools. And it's really only been since the Obama administration emphasized the importance of addressing sexual violence that we saw more and more schools paying attention to this requirement to have a Title IX coordinator. And that person is supposed to make sure that sex discrimination is not occurring on the campus or at the school. Another thing that is required by a school is to have ongoing education about sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. We know that too few students really understand these issues, and too few students are really equipped to know how to address them when it occurs on campus. The school should have a non-discrimination policy, and that policy should, really provide clear information about how to report sex discrimination and what happens when you report sex discrimination to your school. And a lot of students are afraid. They don't know what a process might look like. And if a school isn't upfront and forthcoming about that, it can be a really difficult thing to come forward. Schools are also supposed to investigate complaints of sex discrimination and give students access to resources, including confidential resources where the information will not be shared with a school. So if a student experiences sex discrimination or sexual violence at school, they should have that option to talk to someone like a counselor, a therapist, an advocate that can keep their information confidential and really be that support person for the person who experienced the violence or discrimination. And then when the school is conducting an investigation, if there's going to be a grievance procedure or proceeding to hold someone accountable for sex discrimination, that has to be a timely investigation. It has to be fair to everyone that's involved, and it really should be impartial. And with regard to sexual violence in particular, we really got clarity on these kinds of obligations from the most recent guidance from the Obama administration in 2011 and 2014. And we can talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So you'll see in the green here, there are 3 sets of really important guidance. So when I say guidance, it's really like a letter that the Department of Education writes to schools and says, these are your obligations under this long existing law. Sexual harassment is prohibited under this law. Sexual violence is a kind of sexual harassment, and we want to make sure that you're addressing it appropriately. What has happened now under the Trump administration is that those guidance documents, those letters that help schools know what their obligations are, have been rescinded and taken away. In addition to the helpful information about how to address sexual violence, there was guidance on transgender student rights, and that was also rescinded. So what we're seeing is schools having less direction from the Department of Education rather than more direction, which means that there are some schools out there that will feel less pressure or less responsibility to do what they are required to do under the law. And that, I think, is really why we're having this conversation, because it's important that we stay vigilant and make sure that all schools understand those responsibilities. So we could go on to the next slide. So as we go forward, regardless of what Secretary DeVos has done in the Department of Education right now, we have to remember that Title IX is still the law of the land. It's a law that was passed by Congress. It's a civil rights law, and your school should still be interpreting it as a strong law that protects students. And if it's not, that's something certainly that you should feel empowered to speak out about. And I'd be happy to talk more about this at the end. We have question and answers, or to answer questions about specific aspects of the law.
Thank you, Ellen. So everyone, please put your questions for Ellen in the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end of all of the presentations. Before that, I've just got a couple follow-up questions for you, Ellen. So can you talk a little more about how colleges handled sexual assault incidents before Title IX?
So before 1972, my sense is that schools were not addressing sexual assault. Before the Obama administration really put out these very helpful guidance documents in 2011 and 2014, it was a bit all over the map in terms of schools' resources and I guess expertise in dealing with sexual violence in a trauma-informed way. And unfortunately, there were many schools who had no person who was an expert on sex discrimination or sexual violence. There were many schools that didn't even have a clear place for students to go. And there were many schools that would try to sweep sexual violence under the rug and think that it wasn't their responsibility to address it, and really kind of disempower or try to silence the voices of survivors. So I think that these guidance documents from the Obama administration shined a light on what really needed to happen, and that's that schools needed to step up. They needed to take ownership for the kind of climate that's happening on their campus. They needed to have policies in place to address sexual violence and to support the students who come forward during the process of coming forward, and policies to make clear that students can be expelled for engaging in sexual violence on their campus or at their school.
Yeah, thank you for underscoring how important the Obama era protections for survivors have been, or have been for survivors. And my question is, and I recognize that things are still up in the air, but given where we are now with both the rescindings that you just outlined, as well as Betsy DeVos, Secretary DeVos, meeting with men's rights activists, and frankly, the president, right, and the way he has openly talked in recordings, bragging about sexual assault. How can we anticipate now how things will change since the Obama era protections?
Well, I think that what Betsy DeVos has said, the Department of Education has said, is that they've taken away those guidance documents. They're going to put out new regulations probably. And in the meantime, they've given us this temporary regulation that already shows that they're trying to roll back what Title IX means. And so that's very concerning. Number one example is that in an internal process to hold a sexual predator accountable, the survivor would have no right to appeal. That also suggests, number two, that a higher standard of evidence that's not appropriate for civil rights cases should be applied in the student disciplinary hearings. So this is sort of a technical issue, but really important issue, that since Title IX is a discrimination law, it's a law that we consider a civil right. Most civil cases have a standard of proof when you're proving the case to show that something happened beyond a reasonable doubt. Is more likely than not that something happened. So that's the same in most cases that go to court that is not a criminal case. So if there's a car accident and one person is suing another for damages to their car in the car accident, the legal standard was, is it more likely than not that you were responsible for the damages to the car? That's been the standard that has been used on school disciplinary hearings and on college campuses across the country. Is it more likely than not that the sexual violence occurred or that sex discrimination, sexual harassment occurred? And what we're seeing from Betsy DeVos is that she wants there to be a higher standard, not the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, which is clearly a criminal standard. It's a very difficult standard to prove, but a standard called clear and convincing evidence, which would be a big departure from any civil rights standard that we've seen for other types of civil rights, like race discrimination, disability discrimination, and other civil rights laws involving sex discrimination. So it's just an example of the kind of rollback that we can anticipate, that they will interpret the law in a way that's inconsistent with the law itself.
Thank you for explaining that. And it's so important for the activists on the call to have this information. So please put any and all questions for Ellen in the chat box, and I'm going to pass it over to Pamela.
Thank you so much, Erin and Ellen. So our next speaker is Tracia Banuelos, a student activist at Wichita State University. Tracia is a senior studying psychology and women's studies. In the community, she currently serves on the Young Women of Color for Reproductive Justice Leadership Council through Advocates for Youth as a YP4 fellow, and on the It's On Us Student Advisory Committee. On campus, she serves as the Title IX Student Alliance co-chair, is a McNair Scholar, Feminists on Campus Uniting Students, Focus, and other organizations. She currently works at the Mental Health Association of South Central Kansas as a prevention facilitator and volunteers at the Wichita Family Crisis Center. Currently, she has founded an online comprehensive sexual education program called Know Yourself, designed for Kansas youth in mind. Tracia, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll let you take it away and guide us through your portion of the presentation.
All right, great. I'm so excited to be with you all, so thank you for having me. So again, my name is Tracia Banuelos, and I'm a senior at Wichita State University. So I'm going to talk more about some of the student activism and how we are working with Title IX on our own campus. But I thought it'd be important to first show some of the other issues and things I've been involved with, because I didn't always start my activism with sexual assault. I'll get to that in just a second. But I'm going to put some pictures of just some of the other things on campus that you all might be involved in and that how I got launched into it. So the first picture, I get a training at the American Psychological Association about public policies, learning how to understand the law. The second picture, there was a student government conference I just really loved. We were in LA and I just thought like it's a nice time to have self-care. The third picture, registering voters at a DACA rally very recently on campus. And then the final picture was from a campaign that I had running for student body president, and I didn't win, but I'm thankful, in hindsight, but it's still learning about how to use student government to talk about the issues we have on campus and how to empower your voice. And so this was a very big challenge, but it really got me established and gave me a platform to talk to the entire student body about the issues that I thought were important. We can go to the next slide too. And then on the next slide, a couple more pictures. So from protesting, so we had an incident on our campus where our outgoing president was called the N-word, and I was like, we don't stand for that on our campus. So there's a sign of me saying, "Welcome to the sunken campus," that we had made, and you see my running mate, his face right there. Because again, I'm not afraid to talk about and say the things that need to be said. And just at the Women's March, a picture with me and my friends as a doctoral student, and finally me at the Capitol. And so really these experiences have helped shape me and what it means to be a student. In 2017, we have so much power. But I really didn't start talking about these issues until there was a student government meeting that I got triggered at. So I came to college bearing the weight of being a survivor, but I always felt very branded by my trauma, and I was very nervous about talking about it, because how will people view me once they know what has happened to me or that something has happened to me. And we were in a student government meeting debating conceal and carry on campus, and someone had said that guns can prevent sexual assault. And I looked across the room at some other survivors I know, and they looked at me, and we were all just very taken aback at how dare someone say something like that. And I couldn't even speak because I was just so paralyzed in that moment. And so I waited till the end when we have like a more open forum between senators, and I stood up and I just started crying, and my voice was shaking, and I was just saying how unfair this is to say that guns can prevent sexual assault, because only people can prevent sexual assault. And I was shaking and my voice was shaking, and I kind of shake now talking about it. But I just felt like I just couldn't be silent anymore, because these are student senators who are talking to campus administration about how I want to implement things. And so if your student senators feel this way, and here you are, a student constituent, that's a problem. And so I left the meeting crying, and I had my fiance there and tears in my eyes. And then so many students automatically, were texting me, people saw on the live stream, and I had so many people that I didn't even know were survivors talking to me about, thank you for speaking up, because I too was triggered and this hurt me. And that's when I realized that for myself, that I needed to come out of my own personal shadows and to talk more about these issues on my campus. So Wichita State, it's a public university. We have about 15,000 students on our campus, and Title IX and sexual assault issues are nothing new. It's very convenient that our first Title IX coordinator was hired after there was a Title IX lawsuit against the university. Additionally, one really defining moment was there was a student who used our student newspaper, The Sunflower, to do like a 3-part anonymous expose of her each step of trying to report a sexual assault against another student. And she recorded her responses, she recorded who she met with, and it really just exposed the processes that we have for Wichita State University. So if you click the next slide, you'll see some of my personal efforts. So now that I'm more openly accepting and willing to talk about being a survivor, the Title IX Student Alliance is an important group. So here, now that we do have a Title IX coordinator, there's a student alliance that works with her to implement, to give suggestions, to really do whatever we want to do in regards to Title IX. So our group is made of all students, some community members if they're so willing to, and then some students go to high schools to talk about Title IX. Right now we have, actually this week, have a conference plan to call Title IX from Empowerment to Engagement, where we will have different speakers from locally and nationally come talk about and give breakout sessions about domestic violence, gender-based violence, sexual assault. Reporting is a very informative session. And so that's one of the primary ways that students on our campus can get involved is joining that group. We also have an online training when new students are admitted to the university called a Not Anymore training. And I've expressed some concerns about this, but it's important training. But again, some of these trainings around sexual assault, Title IX, they're not targeted at survivors. I mean, we already know some of the emotional weight because we've been through these things. So these type of trainings are really for students who don't understand, what consent is, levels to consent, who don't understand what's going on. And so it's a great training. I myself did not get through it, but it's very thorough and it breaks down. There's pre-test, post-test, and so I recommend it for students who are not survivors, who just don't understand or want to get more information. And each page has information about sexual assault and how we can spot it, bystander intervention, and things like that. Very briefly, I'll talk about the Know Yourself thing that I'm working on. So through my fellowship and through myself, I'm looking at how can we start earlier talking about Title IX and how can we talk about sexual assault. I had sex ed in my schools 3 times, elementary, middle school, and high school, and I didn't learn about consent until I got to college. And unfortunately, I bear the weight of being a survivor of assault when I came to elementary school. So we had concepts of virginity talking about that in our sex ed. I immediately grappled with it. And it was spent, no one should be 7 years old thinking, am I a virgin or am I not a virgin? And that for me was a defining moment, thinking about how our sexual education should be trauma informed, how they should incorporate the fact that bad things happen to innocent people. We need to be cognizant of it and promote that as well. For me, my goal is to change the culture by promoting healing just as much as we promote all of the resources, just as much as we promote how to report, and just as much as we share stories that can trigger us. And on the second slide are some of the national efforts. So you go ahead and click, thank you, that I've brought to my campus and I'm working on. So my university, this year, I was able to join the It's on Us National Student Advisory Council, which was a really big deal for me being a survivor and having people in my family and friends that are also survivors, so that to be someone that I can use this time to the opportunity to make a change on my campus, I was overcome with emotions. So I am building an It's on Us team from scratch at my university, and I'm trying to create a model so that I can go to other public universities and start up their chapters. The beautiful part about It's on Us is that they have a lot of resources, but my thing is I want to make sure that students aren't just taking a pledge, but they're actively working to change a culture. And then the second group is a group through Advocates for Youth, which is an organization that focuses on sexual liberation and health for young people. And I'm on a group called the Young Women of Color for Reproductive Justice Leadership Council, and making sure that we talk about those marginalized communities that go through trauma, generational trauma, who are even less likely to report their trauma, who also bear these weights as young people. So seeing how we can talk about sexual assault as a reproductive justice issue and how we can really work to change our culture and not celebrate our trauma at all, but learning how we can wake up and know that it's okay that this has happened to me, but I can move and I can exist and I can breathe. And so my personal goal is starting locally, and then working my way nationally, taking models from the national collective and starting to bring it here. So I'm just doing whatever I can. I was speaking about things, definitely trying to make sure I have self-care in the process, but seeing how I can leave an impact so that whenever I'm done with my position, that there are students who can come right up, and so that I'm building a sustainable model to continue on even after I graduate. And then that's all I have for now, but I'll definitely share some articles that we have. And if anyone's interested in starting a student alliance at their university, I can definitely or their high school, I can send over just like a template about how to start it, what a constitution looks like, different positions to have as well.
Thank you so much, Tracia. So I just had a couple of questions. My first question is, how would Betsy DeVos' decision to roll back Title IX affect students at Wichita?
Yeah, so for me, I'm very wary at my university. I'll be very honest. I love it, but I'm nervous because we still have not received information about how the law affects us and what's changed. So being on It's On Us, like in the national group, I can see what other universities are doing and how they're responding and compare and contrast my university. And we have had so many issues with fraternities that are on suspension that come back from suspension. We have groups that are repeat offenders and nothing's happening. So I definitely feel like students are left out of the loop, that there's some gaps left. And I think there's a general perception that Title IX doesn't exist anymore, and that's really disappointing to see. With my university, no matter what's rescinded, we can always go above the law and go above that, but that's not how things are perceived right now. So I'm very nervous for students at this time because we are in a place where it seems like other students' reputation and their donations and donating power is valued more than someone's human rights and their human dignity.
Mm. Goodness. So this is kind of a natural transition from that, which is I was really struck by how you talked about building something sustainable. As a former student activist, I remember, spending my last year like, oh my gosh, I hope that that what we've worked on doesn't fall apart. So if someone was interested in taking action on their campus about sexual assault, what would be your advice? And given everything that you've just shared about kind of the changing climate and the changing perceptions of Title IX?
So first, I would start with just taking a climate of just your university and seeing, are you at a place that has support or are you at a place that doesn't have support? And the very first thing that I would do is find your support system and start to lean on them, because what I wasn't prepared for when I started in this work is how much I would relive my own trauma or start to question things. And I wasn't prepared for, when I see a Me Too from a friend, I'm not prepared for how heartbroken I am when this is what has to bind us. So first, I would say find your support system and prepare yourself emotionally. Second, I would start with your student groups and student governments. I get nervous about student governments because sometimes you have leadership that cares, and sometimes you have leadership that is looking for a way to get notoriety. So if you have a place that wants to make change, that are also survivors as well or accomplices, I would start there. Become a senator, start a committee, get resources, create trainings, see how you can implement things that are not just sharing your stories. Urge recently shared an article talking about pain porn, and I bring it up because after a lot of the Me Too statuses, it seems that everyone wants to know our stories. But if I told you my story, you would break down. Mm-hmm. And you shouldn't need my story to know how valid this is. Mm-hmm. So I would start with one, again, finding your group of people that can support you, and then two, looking for your own personal way of empowerment and engagement. For myself, I find that I'm going to talk about it and I'm not afraid to call someone out. So going into Senate and leading committees, that was very powerful for me. Other students I'm working with on my campus, I have one student who does research. So she just finds evidence-based practices and lets us know. I have another student who's good at digital organizing. So those students make infographics. We're working on an infographic right now about self-care after you've been triggered. I have other students who are tied to the Greek culture. So they're talking about bystander intervention and how to use their sorority sisters and fraternity brothers to change that culture from within. So I would see where your personal strengths lie and start from there, but never to exploit your pain to educate others unless that's part of a process for you. So sometimes for myself, talking about it can make me feel better, but there's a fine line. And if you're not ready to talk about it, then you don't have to. You can just say, I'm a survivor and I am, and that's my story. You never have to, cut yourself open and hurt yourself to make someone else heal. And I think prioritizing your needs is going to be the first step, because it's tough work and it's hard, and there'll be some days where you're going to delete all social media on your phone because you just can't handle it. But the beauty is when you get with the student and you feel like you're making a difference. Very briefly with It's On Us, we had a national call, and it was closed to press, and our special guest was Vice President Joe Biden. And there were like 1,000 people on this call, and to hear someone of his stature talk about, I believe in you, I support you, you have my support. I was crying the entire time, but I'm learning that we can change a culture. It starts with my middle school. I see middle school students who are saying, I'm not going to let that happen. That gets me up in the morning. So making sure that we can define for ourselves too what success looks like. We can't change a culture overnight, but we can make steps to change hearts, and those hearts change other hearts, and then we start to slowly build a movement against this.
Tracia, fantastic advice, and thank you so much for sharing your experience, and then also sharing this wonderful advice and resources for student activists. So hold on until the end of the call. I know there'll be questions, and with that, I will turn it over to Erin.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Tracia. So we're going to move to Alyssa Peterson, who is a state organizer with Know Your Nine, which is a survivor and youth-led project of advocates for youth that aims to empower students to end sexual and dating violence in their schools. Prior to joining Know Your Nine in 2014, she served as a policy analyst in the office of Vice President Joe Biden. Today, she's a student at Yale Law School, interested in the intersections of violence and poverty. Alyssa, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great.
So Know Your Nine is a group of survivor activists. We help organize students across the country to hold their schools and the federal government accountable. So I wanted to quickly talk through how we've used the Obama-era guidance and how we plan to fight Betsy DeVos's efforts to weaken protections for students and their families. So just 6 years ago, as you might recall, most schools did not inform their students about their right to an education free from sexual violence. So in my case, when I was assaulted in the fall of 2011, I had no idea that Title IX covered more than women's sports. But in 2011, when the Obama administration issued the Dear Colleague letter, it sent a signal that the federal government took sexual violence seriously. And for me, it meant a lot to know that the federal government had our backs. So the Dear Colleague letter was revolutionary insofar as it gave student activists like me the tools we needed to change our campuses. But, and as a student activist, I would use the Dear Colleague letter and bring it into every meeting I had with administrators. It helped democratize legal knowledge. So school administrators with having general counsels at the table couldn't tell us that we didn't know what we were talking about, because we could point to the letter and say, there it is, and you aren't complying with Title IX. So the Dear Colleague letter was really revolutionary because it gave us the power to know our rights and to organize around these rights. But actually, as Ellen mentioned, the contents of it have been long established by regulation and precedent and case law. So I wanted to highlight some important elements of the Dear Colleague letter, which for me include, it contained the rights to interim remedies, like if your rapist is in your math class, you have the right to change class schedules or to have him moved out of your class. You could also get tutoring if your grades slipped. And then also, if your rapist lived in your dorm room, in your dorm, then you could have him relocated, and sort of with the goal being that making small changes in your schedule can help make it easier for you to access education. So while this seems like a very radical step, it actually comes from years of guidance. The Bush administration had the same policy, and the Bush administration also said that the burden of receiving accommodations shouldn't be felt by the survivor. It should be felt by the person who is the respondent or the person who's accused of violence. So that was really a helpful thing for people who didn't want to go through a full disciplinary process to get the accommodations that they needed to stay in school. And then another important thing that the Dear Colleague letter said is that survivors shouldn't be charged for the cost of accommodations like counseling. And then also, if a survivor needed to withdraw from a class due to the effects of violence, the school should not charge them for that tuition. So it really baked in, the Dear Colleague letter and the subsequent 2014 FAQ really baked in these important financial protections for people who experience sexual violence. And then the Dear Colleague letter, another important thing is it contained really robust process requirements. So it required, for students who did go through a full disciplinary process, it requires things like both parties have to have notice of when the proceeding is going to be held. They have the opportunity to have an advisor of their choice. They have the opportunity to ask questions through a third party, with the goal of making sure that these proceedings are prompt and equitable for both parties. So if we could go to the next slide. So as you may know, Betsy DeVos has quite a different approach to Title IX. And I think what's really important is to put her efforts to rescind the Dear Colleague letter and the 2014 FAQ and her efforts to scale back federal enforcement in the context of a broader campaign to attack access to education. For example, Betsy DeVos is recently delayed regulations that would help students whose schools defrauded them. She rescinded guidance that protected disabled students. She rescinded guidance that protected transgender students. And now the department is going to turn its efforts to attacking affirmative action, which they term racial preferences. So it's really important to think of what's going on in Title IX as something that is a part of a broader attack on civil rights, and to stand in solidarity with other movements who are also having their rights attacked. In the Title IX context, much of the charge of the attack on Title IX is being led by Candace Jackson, who is a woman who said that 90% of rape claims are due to regretful sex in the New York Times, if you remember who she is. So Betsy DeVos rescinded the 2011 and the 2014 guidance, and she issued interim guidance, which was really quite damaging. It allows schools to use things like clear and convincing standards in disciplinary procedures. And it also allows things like mediation, where a school could force someone who was sexually assaulted to work it out with their perpetrator. So we're really concerned that these measures will decrease survivors' willingness to report. And a lot of the reason why DeVos sort of talks about Title IX is that she stresses this concern about due process. But this is actually a bad faith critique, because Title IX already requires procedures to be prompt and equitable. So if schools do wrongly discipline students, the answer would have been to enforce the Dear Colleague letter rather than rip it up. And that's actually what the policy of the Obama administration was. They would investigate schools who violated the guidance and interfered with the rights of accused students. So our concern about Betsy DeVos is that she's effectively using process as a guise to roll back survivors' rights and to make it easier for people who have assaulted other students to avoid accountability. And I think a recent New York Times article that came out on Sunday is really telling. If you saw it, it featured mothers of people who had been accused of sexual assault. And one of the mothers said, "In my generation, what these girls are going through was never considered assault. It was considered I got stupid and embarrassed." So Betsy DeVos and her deputy, Candace Jackson, are just like these mothers. They're not interested in fair process. They are instead interested in helping people avoid accountability for their actions, even if the price of that is survivors' education. So if we want to go to the next slide. So I think the big question right now is, what can we do to stop Betsy DeVos? The first sort of major thing, as Ellen mentioned, when they rescinded the guidance, they stated that they're going to issue new regulations. So these are things that have the force of law, but they have to go through a very formal process known as notice and comment to put out the regulations. So it's really important for the public to speak out about why Title IX is important, why survivors need these protections, and why some of the proposals that Betsy DeVos has espoused, which include placing higher burdens on survivors than accused students, or even turning these involving law enforcement in the process, are bad policies. So if you go to knowyour9.org, and I can circulate this, we actually have a toolkit for people to participate in notice and comment when it opens, and we'll provide people updates if they want to get involved. The next issue that people can do to stop Betsy is they can work for legislation in their own state. So a lot of students have started to organize at the state level to create better policies. For example, in 2015, students in New York passed an affirmative consent bill that also included measures around transparency, measures around ensuring access to resources, and was a really revolutionary effort. There have been similar bills in Connecticut, Illinois, Minnesota, and even Texas has passed a bill that protects people who report an assault when they were intoxicated from being penalized for being intoxicated. So Know Your Nine is actually written a state policy playbook. It has a bunch of recommendations that advocates can take to their state legislature to try to move the ball in Title IX and make sure that survivors are protected, even if the federal government doesn't want to afford us that protection. So if you're interested in that playbook, please see knowyour9.org or reach out to me. And then I think the third thing that schools can do to help enforce Title IX when the Department of Education is no longer interested in doing so is to hold their school accountable. A lot of schools have come forward thanks to the pressure of students and said that they will maintain their policies. And Know Your Nine has actually written an open letter toolkit, and that's also on our website, that contains some sample language that people can use to hold schools accountable, to write a public letter to your president to tell them to maintain the policies. So those are some of the action steps that you can do to help defend Title IX.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. So a couple questions for you. Can you talk some more about the challenges that survivors face in continuing their education?
Yeah, so for a lot of survivors, many survivors need resources, and that's something where, in my case, my perpetrator lived in my dorm, so it was really difficult to see him coming home each day. So other survivors have issues where they need to drop out of school because they don't want to go to a school with their perpetrator. So there are a lot of different barriers, but I think what's really important is thinking about the kinds of costs that these barriers impose. So for a survivor who needs counseling or needs to move off campus, there are significant costs associated with that. There are also costs associated with leaving school. You could forfeit tuition, or a lot of survivors experience the barrier of they're distracted, their grades may decline, they may lose access to scholarships that they need to maintain a certain GPA for because they experienced violence. So what's really important for schools, and what was previously required, was schools would have to pay for those accommodations to make sure that students did not incur financial-based barriers. And then that's something that we would like to see enshrined at the state level. And then also the issue of making sure that students who leave school are getting counseling about student debt, because often when you leave school, those loans start to accrue interest. So we'd like to see reforms at the federal level to make sure that students who need to leave school because of violence aren't penalized for doing so.
Thank you for continuing to do proactive work in this difficult climate. I think that's an important takeaway in all areas of reproductive justice work, that we must continue to push forward for what we really want and need, and not just be in defense. We have to do both. So my last question for you is, how does Title IX ensure equal and fair disciplinary hearings for all students?
So Title IX, as Ellen said, Title IX should be using a standard known as preponderance of the evidence. And that's a standard in disciplinary proceedings that really has the benefit of valuing each party's access to education equally. It basically acknowledges that sometimes if a person who is alleged to have assaulted someone is not held responsible, that survivor will drop out. So Title IX doesn't privilege one person's education over the other. They should be weighted equally. And then also Title IX, schools are required to provide prompt and equitable grievance procedures. So if a school is favoring an accused student, or frankly, which happens more often than they're favoring a survivor, that is a violation of Title IX, and the Department of Education should investigate. So there really are those protections baked into the regulations. And then there's also been federal laws that have been passed that really outline robust protections, like the right to an advisor of your choosing, the right to have notice, and the right to be able to ask questions of decision makers to make sure that all the information that's relevant is being brought into the light.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to move us along so we can get to as many questions as possible. Want to have an encouragement for everyone who's listening to this webinar to be sure to sign up for alerts at www.reproaction.org. That way you won't miss a thing. We run these webinars every month and they are free and open to the public. We also encourage you to follow us on social media. We are Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And also an encouragement to save the date for our next Act and Learn webinar, which will take place on Thursday, November 30th. And our topic next month will be 1 year after Stand Up, Native Activism in Reproductive Justice Work. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Pamela to moderate Q&A.
Thank you so much. So let's jump right in. We have an anonymous question that is, as a survivor, I sometimes have trouble working in activism spaces around sexual assault, but it's also one of the issues that galvanizes me most. Do any of the panelists have tips for staying active and amplifying other stories when you're not always willing to share your own? And also any self-care tips for dealing with often upsetting material? Tracia, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I was hopping back on right now. Yeah, so that's so real. And for myself, I learned that first it takes time to just decide when I can want to just talk about it. Like I said, for me, like when It's On Us first came out, I was very critical. I saw people changing their Facebook profiles, so like, you all are doing nothing. You know, you're still friends with rapists and pedophiles, so you mean nothing to me. And it wasn't until a couple years later that I figured that I could do this work. And it started with reproductive justice, and then it brought back into sexual assault. So my first piece is just deciding for yourself, like when the time is right for you. I battled back and forth with going to therapy, and I learned that, I needed to get on antidepressants. And so I had a lot of things that were working against me and working against my healing process. So first, like, what's your process for healing? And then what is your activism call? Secondly, talking to different friends and seeing those who could talk about their stories and what was healing for them. For myself, to talk about it and to speak it into existence and to say this is a systemic issue, it took the feelings of guilt and blame off of myself. So for me personally, it was cathartic to talk about it, but not everyone is like that. And I think understanding your boundaries to never violate your own boundaries for a greater cause, because you don't need to martyr yourself. So I would see for yourself first, what is cathartic for you? Is talking about it with other survivors cathartic? I would start there, and then you can work your way up to a public platform. But activism looks different. Activism doesn't always mean holding a sign and holding a banner or something. Sometimes it means that you're doing research. It means that you're working in nonprofits, you're volunteering. So again, rethinking your viewpoint of activism, as well as for self-care, taking time to get off digital. After I saw the hashtag #MeToo, I had like a mental breakdown, and I was like, how dare you ask for my story? So I deleted my apps off of my phone. I talked to my friends. I downloaded the BuzzFeed Tasty app. I watched videos about food. I did nothing talking about activism because I needed to take a break. Because again, I'm one of those people that gets overly involved. So definitely taking time to get off of the internet, to not feel, because depression and anxiety are funny and they like to be fueled. And sometimes we're thinking, I can get through it, I'm just gonna rip the Band-Aid off. Trauma doesn't work like that. So seeing how can we not trigger ourselves and how can we not martyr ourselves, and what can I do that really makes me enjoy this? So when I was ready to get back, it wasn't until I had a group chat and we were ranting about the Me Too that I was like, okay, I'm ready to get back to talking about it. But I had to take a break and put myself first.
Great advice. Thank you so much for that. So we're coming up on time, but I think we have time for just one more question, which was, I think this is one for Ellen, but if you could talk about the possible lawsuits coming forth, brought forward against DeVos and the Trump administration. And specific question was about Wendy Murphy's lawsuit, not striking this attendee as having viable claims. Ellen, are you still on?
Oh, I'm sorry. I had I had myself on mute.
That's okay. Go ahead.
I think that's the equal means equal lawsuit. Is that right?
I believe so.
Yeah. So last week, an organization called Equal Means Equal filed a lawsuit against the Department of Education, and it basically said that the decision to scrap the Obama 2011 and 2014 guidance didn't follow something that's called the Administrative Procedures Act. And it also suggests, I mean, I haven't looked at the lawsuit in detail, but I believe that it also suggests that the ways that that Betsy DeVos has been talking about sex discrimination, that it would be unconstitutional because it would subject sex discrimination to kind of different standards than other civil rights laws. And so we haven't seen any back and forth action on that lawsuit right now. It just got filed. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see more survivors coming together and challenging Betsy DeVos's actions. And I think that the other kinds of lawsuits we're going to see are survivors filing lawsuits against their schools and universities that are failing to uphold what Title IX inherently means, and what Title IX guidance says, and what Title IX regulation says. So I think that those are the kinds of lawsuits that we can expect over the next few years.
Thank you so much. So we are at time, and I want to respect everybody's evening, but thank you so much to all of our panelists, Alyssa, Ellen, and Tracia, for this very, very insightful and I think very critical webinar. We really appreciate your guidance and your expertise. We'd like to also thank our attendees, and a very special thank you to Caitlin Blenny, our Virginia organizer, for being the lead organizer of this webinar. And with that, I will say good evening, and I hope that folks will look in their email. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar and hopefully some resources that were mentioned on the call as well. Thank you and good night.